I've spent $4,200 on this vintage crystal champagne tonight, and I won't have the aroma ruined by the scent of industrial floor cleaner emanating from your mother," Sterling Whitmore declared, his voice cutting through the soft jazz like a serrated blade as he waved a manicured hand toward my mother's seat at the far end of the mahogany table. My mother, wearing a $28 lilac cardigan from Kohl's that had been washed so many times the fabric was beginning to pill at the elbows, instinctively pulled her sleeves over her red, chemical-burned knuckles. "My name is Cassidy Thorne. I'm 26 years old, and I recently earned my master's in forensic accounting from the University of Virginia, a degree I paid for by working 3 jobs while my mother scrubbed the marble floors of men exactly like the one currently insulting her. We were sitting in the private dining room of L'Espalier, where the tasting menu alone costs more than my mother makes in a week of 40-hour shifts. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive truffles, aged leather, and the suffocating arrogance of the Whitmore family. Sterling, my father-in-law-to-be, adjusted his silk tie, which probably cost more than our 2014 Honda Civic, and looked at my mother with a mixture of pity and genuine disgust that made my blood turn to ice. To understand how we ended up at this table, surrounded by $150 shot Zwiesel crystal glasses and silver-plated cutlery, you have to understand the dynamic of the Thorne-Whitmore engagement. My fiancé, Julian, is a third-generation real estate heir who drives a 2024 Porsche 911 Carrera in gentian blue metallic. He is the golden child of the Greenwich social scene, a man who has never seen a bill he couldn't pay or a door that wouldn't open for him. And then there's me. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in a part of Richmond where the streetlights are frequently shot out, and the local grocery store is a corner bodega that sells day-old bread. My mother, Elena, has been a professional cleaner for 25 years. She has spent her life on her knees so that I could stand on mine. Her hands are a map of her sacrifice, the skin thin and translucent, scarred by years of exposure to bleach, ammonia, and high-strength degreasers. When she reached for her glass of water, Sterling's eyes tracked the movement with the same intensity a scientist might use to observe a lab rat. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning of this evening, which was supposed to be a celebratory dinner for our upcoming wedding. I had spent 3 hours getting ready in our apartment, which felt increasingly cramped as the wedding date approached. I pulled on a dress I'd found on a clearance rack at Nordstrom Rack, a simple navy sheath that I hoped looked expensive enough to pass muster with Julian's mother, Beatrice. My mother had arrived early, looking nervous in her best Kohl's outfit, her hair neatly pinned back, her eyes bright with the hope that she might finally be accepted into this world I was marrying into. We took an Uber Black to the restaurant because Julian didn't want my mother's car, an old sedan with a rattling muffler and a permanent scent of pine-scented pine sol, parked in the valet line next to the Ferraris and Bentleys. The moment we walked into the restaurant, the contrast was deafening. The hostess, a woman in a $2,000 Prada suit, looked at my mother's scuffed shoes and then at me, her professional smile faltering for just a microsecond. We were led to the back, to the Sterling suite, where Julian and his parents were already seated. Sterling was already on his second glass of scotch, a Macallan 25 that retails for roughly $2,500 a bottle. He didn't stand when we entered. Beatrice merely nodded, her pearls gleaming under the recessed LED lighting. Julian squeezed my hand, but his eyes stayed on his phone, checking the closing prices of some tech stock he'd invested in that morning. The insults started small. A comment about the texture of my mother's cardigan compared to Beatrice's cashmere wrap. A subtle joke about the lack of reputable country clubs in our zip code. But then the champagne arrived. The sommelier presented the 2008 Louis Roederer Cristal with a level of reverence usually reserved for religious relics. He poured a small amount for Sterling to taste. Sterling swirled the liquid, inhaled deeply, and then froze. That was when he made the comment about the industrial cleaner. He didn't say it quietly. He said it with the clear, resonant tone of a man who was used to being obeyed. The silence that followed was heavy. I could hear the faint hum of the HVAC system and the distant clinking of dishes from the kitchen. My mother looked down at her plate, where a tiny portion of Wagyu beef sat untouched. She looked small. For the first time in my life, I realized that the woman who had protected me from every bully in my neighborhood was now completely defenseless against a man with a checkbook and a cruel tongue. Julian didn't say anything. He just took a sip of his wine and looked at the ceiling, as if the ceiling were the most interesting thing in the world. Now you might think I would cry. You might think I would get up and run out of the room, but you have to remember that I am a forensic accountant. My entire job is based on finding the things people try to hide. I spent 2 years at a boutique firm in Richmond before moving to a larger practice, and I specialize in hidden assets, offshore accounts, and corporate fraud. I spend my days looking at balance sheets and realizing that the people who scream the loudest about their wealth are often the ones who are one bad quarter away from total collapse. And as I sat there, watching my mother shrink under Sterling's gaze, I remembered a file I had come across 3 months ago while doing some pro bono work for a nonprofit that investigates predatory lending. The Whitmore name had appeared in a series of shell company registrations based in the Cayman Islands. At the time, I had ignored it, thinking it was just typical high-net-worth tax planning. But as Sterling continued to berate my mother, telling her that she should perhaps sit in the hallway until the main course was finished so as not to offend the olfactory senses of the other guests, a switch flipped in my brain. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I wasn't checking my social media, I was accessing my secure work cloud. I looked at Sterling. His face was flushed with the arrogance of a man who thinks he is untouchable. He was currently explaining to Beatrice that the help these days had no sense of propriety. I thought about the $4,200 he'd spent on the champagne. I thought about the $12,000 monthly maintenance fee on their Manhattan penthouse that was currently 3 months past due, according to the public records I'd glanced at last week out of pure curiosity. I thought about the black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe that followed him everywhere, driven by a man he called his driver, but who I now realized was likely a private investigator hired by his creditors. "Sterling," I said, my voice steady and calm, the same voice I use when I'm testifying in a deposition. He stopped mid-sentence and looked at me, his eyebrows arched in annoyance. "Sterling, it's interesting you mention the scent of industrial cleaner. It's a very honest smell. It's the smell of hard work. It's certainly more pleasant than the scent of a crumbling empire." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Julian finally looked up from his phone, his face pale. "Cassidy, what are you doing?" he hissed. I ignored him. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the white linen tablecloth. I looked Sterling straight in the eye. I noticed the way his pupils dilated just a fraction. He knew exactly what I was talking about. "I've been looking at some very interesting ledger entries lately, Sterling. Specifically, the ones related to Whitmore Holdings and the recent margin calls on your commercial real estate portfolio in Connecticut. It seems that $4,200 for a bottle of champagne is a bit of an extravagant expense for a man who is currently facing a foreclosure notice on his primary residence." The color drained from Sterling's face so fast it was almost comical. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a thin, strangled rasp. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he managed to say, though his hands were now shaking so badly that he had to set his glass down. But I did. I had the numbers. I had the dates. I had the names of the banks. I had spent my life being underestimated because of where I came from and who my mother was. I had spent my life watching her work herself to the bone for people who didn't know her name. And in that moment, at that $50,000 mahogany table, the power dynamic shifted. My mother looked at me, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She didn't want to fight. She just wanted to survive the night. But I wasn't just surviving. I was dismantling. I watched as Sterling's wife looked at him, the first seeds of doubt planting themselves in her manicured mind. I watched Julian realize that the woman he thought was a quiet, grateful scholarship student was actually the one person in the world who could see exactly how much he was actually worth. And the answer was 0. Family isn't blood. Family isn't a name on a building or a vintage in a glass. Family is the person who stays when the truth comes out. And as I looked at my mother, with her red knuckles and her pilling cardigan, I realized that she was the only person at this table who wasn't a fraud. She was the only one whose value didn't depend on a bank statement or a bottle of wine. I stood up, reached over, and took my mother's hand. Her skin was rough, but her grip was like iron. "We're leaving, Mom," I said. "I think the smell of desperation in here is starting to ruin my appetite." We walked out of the room, leaving the $4,200 champagne to go flat in the glasses of people who couldn't afford to pay for it. Outside, the night air was cold and smelled of rain and car exhaust, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever smelled. The financial gap between us was not just a difference in bank balances or the number of zeros at the end of a quarterly statement. It was a titanium wall, cold and impenetrable, reinforced by generations of entitlement on one side and decades of bone-deep exhaustion on the other. My mother, Lucia Thorne, has spent 22 grueling years working as a lead custodian at St. Jude's Hospital, a woman whose hands have been dipped in enough bleach and industrial-grade Lysol to dissolve the very fingerprints that identify her as a citizen of this world. She earns exactly $19.50 an hour, a wage that she stretches with the precision of a master architect to cover the realities of our existence. For as long as I can remember, she raised me in a 580-square-foot duplex in a cramped corner of Richmond, where the walls are so thin you can hear the neighbor's television through the drywall, and the air always carries the faint metallic scent of the nearby train tracks. We survived winters by keeping the thermostat strictly at 62 degrees, a number etched into my mind like a sacred commandment, all to ensure that the monthly utility bill from Dominion Energy never crept above $180, because even a $20 fluctuation could mean the difference between a full pantry and a week of boxed macaroni and cheese. My mother would wear 2 sweaters and a pair of wool socks she'd mended a dozen times, sitting on our sunken thrift store sofa with a cup of generic black tea, never once complaining about the chill that settled into her joints after an 8-hour shift of mopping emergency room floors. In stark, sickening contrast, my fiancé's father, Sterling Whitmore, occupies a reality that feels like a different planet entirely, residing in a $3.8 million limestone mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, where the heated marble floors in his master bathroom alone probably consume more electricity in a day than our entire duplex did in a month. Sterling is the kind of man who wears $1,200 Tom Ford suits tailored to his exact specifications just to eat his morning grapefruit and read the Wall Street Journal at a breakfast table made of reclaimed French oak. To him, the world is divided into those who own the limestone and those who are paid to scrub it. And it was painfully clear from the moment we sat down at L'Espalier that in his narrow, gilded eyes, my mother wasn't a guest or a future member of his family. She was merely the help that had accidentally wandered away from her station and sat at the main table by some clerical error of the universe. I watched Sterling as he adjusted his platinum cufflinks, the metal catching the light from the Swarovski chandelier above us, and I could see the literal physical discomfort he felt being within 6 feet of a woman who didn't smell like Chanel No. 5 or expensive cigars. My mother sat there with her back straighter than I had ever seen it, her eyes fixed on the silver butter knife as if it were a complex surgical instrument she was trying to understand. She was wearing her Sunday best, a modest lilac cardigan she'd saved for months to buy from Kohl's, and she had spent an hour that morning carefully painting her nails a soft pink to hide the chemical yellowing that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Every time she moved, the slight scent of lavender-scented hand cream wafted toward Sterling, but to him, it was clearly overshadowed by the imagined odor of the hospital wards she cleaned. He didn't see the woman who had stayed up until 3 a.m., helping me study for my forensic accounting exams. He didn't see the woman who had once walked 2 miles in a rainstorm because the Honda wouldn't start and she refused to be late for her shift. He only saw a custodian. He saw $19.50 an hour. He saw someone who didn't belong in a room where the tasting menu featured Osetra caviar and Wagyu beef flown in from the Hyogo prefecture. Julian, my fiancé, sat between these two worlds like a ghost, his 2024 gentian blue Porsche 911 parked outside as a symbol of the life he was born into, while he stayed silent as his father's lip curled in a sneer that was more eloquent than any insult. Sterling reached for his glass of 2008 Cristal, the gold liquid shimmering against the $4,200 bottle price, and he didn't even look at my mother when he spoke, instead addressing the sommelier as if she were a piece of furniture that needed to be moved. The hyper-realism of the moment was suffocating, from the exact weight of the Christoffel silverware in my hand to the subtle, expensive hum of the restaurant's climate control system, which was currently set to a perfect 72 degrees, a luxury my mother and I had never permitted ourselves. I thought about the $180 utility bill that used to make her hands shake with stress, and then I looked at the wine list on the table where a single glass of Cabernet was listed for $85. The injustice of it didn't just hurt, it vibrated in my chest like a low-frequency hum. Sterling began to talk about the recent renovations to his Greenwich estate, detailing the $250,000 he'd spent on a custom wine cellar lined with obsidian, and then he paused, turning his cold, gray eyes toward my mother for the first time that evening. "And tell me, Lucia," he said, his voice dripping with a patronizing sweetness that felt like acid. "I imagine the maintenance at a facility like St. Jude's is quite vigorous. I've often wondered how people in your position manage to keep track of so many different chemicals without, well, an advanced education." My mother's hand faltered, her fork clicking against the fine bone china with a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silent room. She didn't look up, but I saw her grip the fabric of her $28 cardigan until her knuckles turned white, the red, irritated skin from the hospital's harsh detergents standing out in stark relief against the cheap wool. Sterling's wife, Beatrice, let out a small, tittering laugh that was as sharp as a diamond, smoothing the front of her Oscar de la Renta gown, which probably cost more than my mother's annual salary. "Oh, Sterling, don't be so gauche," she remarked, though her eyes were just as predatory as his. "I'm sure Lucia is very good at her job. Someone has to ensure the doctors have a clean space to do the real work." The condescension was a physical weight, a thick layer of grease over everything in the room. I looked at Julian, hoping for a spark of defense, a momentary lapse in his loyalty to the Whitmore brand, but he was busy meticulously cutting a piece of truffle-crusted venison, his eyes downcast, his silence a resounding endorsement of his parents' cruelty. He knew about the 580-square-foot duplex. He had been there exactly once, stepping over the threshold with the caution of a man entering a hazardous waste zone, looking at our worn linoleum floors and the ancient General Electric refrigerator that groaned every time the compressor kicked in. He knew the $180 bill was a mountain for us, yet here he was, breathing the air of a $3.8 million mansion and drinking champagne that cost more than my car. And he said absolutely nothing. I felt the forensic accountant in me start to take over, the part of my brain that sees the world in debits and credits, in assets and liabilities. I began to mentally audit the man sitting across from me. Sterling Whitmore, the man who treated my mother like a stain on the upholstery, was a man built on a foundation of leverage and debt. I knew for a fact, through the whispers of the Richmond financial circles and the deep-dive research I'd done on Whitmore Holdings, that his $3.8 million mansion was leveraged to the hilt with a second mortgage from a boutique firm in Manhattan. I knew his Tom Ford suits were likely purchased on a revolving credit line that was currently nearing its limit. I knew that while he looked down at my mother's $19.50 an hour, her money was real, earned in the sweat and the ache of her muscles, whereas his wealth was a shimmering mirage of credit swaps and decaying commercial real estate. Every time he took a sip of that Cristal, he was essentially drinking someone else's money, probably the deposits of the very people he looked down upon. The sound of the jazz music in the background, a soft recording of Miles Davis, seemed to mock the tension at the table. Sterling leaned back, his chest expanding with the pride of a man who thinks he has already won the game. He signaled for the waiter to bring another bottle, a gesture of dominance intended to remind everyone that he was the one holding the check, the one who decided who got to eat and who got to starve. My mother finally looked up, her face pale but her gaze steady, meeting Sterling's eyes with a quiet dignity that his $1,200 suit could never buy. "I do my best to make sure the hospital is safe for the children, Sterling," she said softly, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who has spent too many years breathing in floor wax and industrial cleaners. "It's important work, even if it isn't fancy." Sterling didn't even blink. He just looked through her as if she were a window he'd decided not to clean. "Fancy or not," he replied, checking his $45,000 Patek Philippe watch. "It's a world away from Greenwich, and I think we all know where our priorities lie tonight." He then turned to Julian and started talking about a merger, completely erasing my mother from the conversation as if she had ceased to exist the moment she spoke. I sat there, my fingers tracing the edge of my phone in my lap, thinking about the files I had stored on my secure drive. I thought about the $19.50 an hour, and the $180 utility bills, and the 580-square-foot duplex that was filled with more love and honesty than this limestone tomb would ever see. I realized then that the titanium wall between us wasn't built by the Whitmores to keep us out. It was something I was going to use to crush them, brick by expensive, leveraged brick. Family isn't the name on the deed or the label on the suit. It's the person who sits in the 62-degree cold with you and makes sure you have enough to eat. And as Sterling laughed at a joke Julian made, I knew that the real help in this room wasn't my mother. It was the man who didn't even realize his empire was already on fire. The breaking point did not happen in a burst of cinematic shouting or a dramatic overturning of furniture, but rather in the cold, clinical precision of a social execution that occurred during my graduation dinner at the Gilded Lily, a restaurant where the velvet curtains are a deep, bruised crimson, and the lighting is dimmed just enough to hide the predatory nature of the people dining within its walls. We were seated at a circular table draped in Egyptian cotton linens that felt like heavy silk against my skin, a stark contrast to the rough denim of the jeans I had worn under my graduation gown only hours earlier. The air was thick with the scent of aged balsamic and the underlying sharp metallic tang of old money that seemed to radiate from Sterling Whitmore's very pores. When the waiter, a man who moved with the silent, spectral grace of someone trained to be invisible, placed the bowls of truffle risotto on the table, the steam carried the earthy, pungent aroma of fungi harvested from the Italian countryside, a dish that cost more than my mother earned in a full day of scrubbing hospital corridors. It was in that moment, as the gold leaf garnish on the risotto caught the flicker of the candlelight, that Sterling leaned over the table, his $1,200 Tom Ford suit jacket bunching slightly at the shoulders, and whispered with a venomous clarity that my mother's peeling skin was ruining his appetite. He didn't even have the decency to look her in the eye when he said it. Instead, he stared at the red, flaking patches on her knuckles, those badges of honor earned from 22 years of plunging her hands into vats of industrial-grade bleach and caustic degreasers at St. Jude's Hospital. My mother, Lucia, who had spent the last 2 decades making sure every cent of her $19.50 an hour went toward my tuition and our $180 monthly utility bills, froze with her fork halfway to her mouth, her body becoming as rigid as the limestone in Sterling's Greenwich mansion. The silence that followed was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until I could hear the frantic drumming of my own heart against my ribs. Sterling then reached into his alligator skin wallet, extracted a crisp, serialized $20 bill with the casual indifference of a man throwing a bone to a stray dog, and slid it across the white tablecloth toward her. He told her, in a voice that was smooth and terrifyingly calm, to go find a diner where people like her belong, his words implying that her very presence was a contaminant in his filtered, high society air. I looked at my fiancé, Harrison, the man I had promised to spend my life with, expecting him to rise, to shout, to defend the woman who had welcomed him into our 580-square-foot duplex with a plate of homemade cookies and a genuine smile. Instead, Harrison didn't say a single word. He just reached up with a manicured hand to adjust his $350 18-karat gold tie clip, a polished bar of metal that seemed to anchor him to his father's world of heartless privilege. He pointedly looked down at his iPhone 15 Pro, his thumbs scrolling through a feed of senseless data, as if the psychological murder of my mother was nothing more than a minor social inconvenience he needed to ignore. I watched a single heavy tear roll down my mother's cheek, tracking through the faint dust of the cheap drugstore powder she had applied so carefully that afternoon. And I saw it vanish into her $12 side salad, a small pile of greens that was the only thing on the menu she felt comfortable ordering because she didn't want to be a burden on Sterling's tab. I didn't scream, and I didn't let the white-hot rage that was incinerating my insides show on my face, because I am a forensic accountant, and I have learned that the most effective way to destroy a man is not with noise, but with the quiet, methodical application of the truth. I reached out and took the $20 bill from the table, the paper feeling oily and tainted in my hand, and I tucked it deep into my pocket, treating it not as a tip, but as a down payment on the debt of dignity Sterling was about to owe me. I stood up, my chair legs making a sharp, discordant screech against the polished parquet floor that caused the socialites at the next table to glance over with arched eyebrows. I didn't look at Sterling, whose face was twisted into a smug mask of victory, and I didn't look at Harrison, who remained a coward in gold-plated shackles. I placed my hand on my mother's trembling shoulder, feeling the thinness of her Kohl's cardigan and the strength of the woman underneath who had survived much worse than a billionaire's ego. "Come on, Mom, we're leaving," I said, my voice coming out with a cold, terrifying level of composure that seemed to finally make Harrison look up from his screen with a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. We walked out of the Gilded Lily, passing the $200,000 black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe idling at the curb, and as we stepped onto the sidewalk where the cold Richmond air hit our faces, I felt the titanium wall between my world and theirs finally shatter, leaving me with a clear, unobstructed view of exactly how I was going to make Sterling Whitmore regret the day he ever looked at my mother's hands. The walk to the parking garage was silent. The sound of our heels, my mother's scuffed $15 Payless pumps and my own graduation heels, clacking against the pavement in a rhythmic, militaristic cadence. I looked at my mother in the harsh, yellow glow of the streetlights and saw her wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, the very hand Sterling had found so repulsive. Every red mark on her skin was a testament to her love for me, a record of every floor she had mopped and every bathroom she had sanitized so that I wouldn't have to. I thought about the $3.8 million mansion in Greenwich and the $1,200 suits, and I realized that Sterling wasn't just wealthy. He was a hollowed-out shell of a human being who used money to fill the void where his soul should have been. Harrison was no different, a secondary shadow cast by his father's immense dark light, and the realization that I had almost tied my life to his made a wave of nausea roll through me that was stronger than the scent of the truffle risotto we had left behind. When we reached my 2014 Honda Civic, a car that Sterling had once joked should be towed away for being an eyesore, I unlocked the doors with a defiant beep and helped my mother into the passenger seat, the interior smelling faintly of the lavender air freshener she always bought to mask the scent of the hospital. As I pulled out of the garage and onto the main road, I felt the $20 bill in my pocket like a hot coal. Sterling thought he had dismissed a servant, but what he had actually done was trigger an audit of his entire existence by the one person who knew exactly where all his skeletons were buried. I thought about the files I had seen on my firm's server, the ones I wasn't supposed to look at but had found during a late-night session when the numbers didn't add up. Sterling's limestone empire was built on a series of fraudulent valuations and offshore shell companies that were currently being circled by the SEC like sharks sensing blood in the water. He had insulted the woman who had sacrificed everything for the truth, and now the truth was going to be the very thing that stripped him of his Tom Ford suits and his $4,200 bottles of champagne. My mother sat beside me, her breathing finally evening out as we drove toward our 580-square-foot duplex, the place where we kept the heat at 62 degrees, but where the air was never thick with the stench of cruelty. She looked out the window at the passing city lights, her reflection in the glass showing a woman who was tired but unbroken, a lead custodian who had more grace in her pinky finger than the entire Whitmore family had in their ancestral line. I reached over and took her hand, the skin rough and peeling just as Sterling had said, and I squeezed it with all the strength I had. "You're never going to have to set foot in a room with those people again, Mom," I whispered, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. The $20 bill was still in my pocket, and I decided then that I would keep it, framing it as a reminder of the night I stopped being a victim of their status and started being the architect of their downfall. Sterling Whitmore thought he was teaching my mother a lesson about where she belonged, but he had failed to realize that when you push someone who has nothing left to lose, they become the most dangerous person in the room. I was no longer just Cassidy Thorne, the girl from the duplex. I was the forensic accountant who was about to prove that the Whitmore fortune was nothing more than industrial floor cleaner disguised as champagne, and I was going to enjoy every second of the cleanup. We turned onto our street, the small, familiar houses standing like silent guardians in the dark, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of our $180 utility bill or the cramped dimensions of our living room. I felt the expansion of a new purpose, a cold and calculated mission to ensure that the next time Sterling Whitmore saw my mother's hands, they would be the ones signing the papers that took everything he owned. Family isn't about the name on the building or the price of the tie clip. It's about the person who walks you out of the fire, and as I parked the car and looked at my mother, I knew that I had already won, because I was the only one at that table who knew the true value of a life spent in service of someone else. That night, at precisely 2:14 a.m., the world outside my cramped studio apartment was muffled by a heavy, oppressive silence. Yet inside, the air was vibrating with the frantic, rhythmic ticking of my wall clock and the cold, sharp clarity of a hunter who had finally caught the scent of her prey. I sat cross-legged on the worn hardwood floor, the grain of the wood pressing into my skin through my thin leggings, surrounded by 14 meticulously organized bank statements and a thick yellow legal pad that felt like a weapon in my hands. The glow from my MacBook Pro, currently displaying a complex spreadsheet of offshore wire transfers, cast a clinical blue-white light over the paper, illuminating the path I was about to carve through the Whitmore family legacy. I realized in that moment of profound stillness that Sterling's celebrated old money was not the solid ancestral bedrock he claimed it to be, but was instead a rotting foundation built on a series of calculated new crimes that were hidden beneath layers of prestige and limestone. My mother was asleep in the other room, her breathing heavy with the exhaustion of a woman who had been humiliated for her honesty. And as I looked at the red, irritated skin of her hands earlier that evening, I felt a shift in my soul that was permanent and irreversible. I picked up a black Pilot G2 pen and drew a single, unwavering vertical line down the dead center of the yellow legal pad, creating a divide that would eventually swallow the Whitmore name whole. On the left side of the page, in sharp, aggressive block letters, I wrote the words, "his arrogance," and on the right, I wrote his tax liabilities, beginning a tally that would prove the former was inversely proportional to the actual stability of the latter. My decision was not born of heat or impulsive anger, but was rather a cold and calculated mathematical certainty. I was no longer going to marry into this family to seek their approval or endure their condescension, but instead, I was going to use every ounce of my forensic accounting training to audit them into the absolute ground. The hyper-realism of the situation settled around me like a shroud as I began to cross-reference the 14 bank statements with the public filings of Whitmore Holdings, noting the exact timestamps of transfers that occurred at 11:59 p.m. on the final day of every fiscal quarter, a classic signature of window dressing to hide liquidity shortages. I looked at the $4,200 crystal champagne Sterling had boasted about, and realized it was purchased with a corporate credit card tied to an account that was technically designated for employee healthcare premiums. A discovery that made my stomach churn with a mixture of disgust and predatory excitement. The yellow legal pad began to fill with a map of Sterling's deceit, a web of shell companies with names like Azure Management and Greenwich Heights Partners, all of which shared a single P.O. box in the Cayman Islands that I had tracked down through a deep dive into the Paradise Papers database. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the corner, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to synchronize with the pulsing of the data on my screen, and I felt a strange sense of peace as I realized that while Sterling had 1,200 Tom Ford suits, I had the truth, and the truth was a far more durable fabric. Every time I found a discrepancy, like the $250,000 renovation of his wine cellar that had been illegally written off as a commercial equipment expense, I felt the titanium wall he had built between our classes begin to hairline fracture. The financial gap he used as a weapon was about to become the very pit he fell into, and I was the one holding the shovel, meticulously documenting every grain of dirt. By 3:45 a.m., the floor was a sea of paper, a physical manifestation of a house of cards that was waiting for a single well-placed breeze to come crashing down. I examined the $20 bill Sterling had handed my mother, which was still sitting on my desk like a cursed relic, and I thought about the sheer scale of the tax evasion I was uncovering, which likely exceeded $15 million over the last 6 fiscal years alone. I noted the specific model numbers of the luxury vehicles they paraded, from Julian's 2024 Gentian Blue Porsche 911 to Sterling's black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country, and I found the lease agreements that were currently in technical default because the Whitmores were using the cash flow from their decaying commercial properties to pay for the appearances of wealth rather than the substance of it. My name is Cassidy Thorne, and as I sat there in the dark, my eyes burning from the blue light and the intensity of the search, I realized that I had spent my entire life being taught to be grateful for the crumbs of the elite, but now I was the one who was going to determine the size of their portion. The $180 utility bill that used to terrify my mother was a drop in the bucket compared to the $1.2 million IRS lien I was starting to piece together. A lien that would be triggered the moment I sent my finalized dossier to the Criminal Investigation Division. The silence of the apartment was occasionally broken by the distant sound of a siren on the Richmond streets, a reminder that the world outside was still functioning under the illusion that men like Sterling Whitmore were the pillars of society. I thought about Harrison and the way he had adjusted his $350 gold tie clip while his father insulted the woman who had birthed his fiancé, and I felt a chilling sense of relief that I had seen his true nature before I had signed a marriage license that would have tethered my credit score to their impending bankruptcy. I wrote down the exact amount of the interest-only payments they were struggling to make on the Greenwich mansion, a staggering $22,400 a month, and contrasted it with my mother's $19.50 hourly wage, realizing that my mother was actually wealthier in the only way that mattered because her assets were not built on a foundation of lies. The internal echo of Sterling's voice calling my mother the help rang in my ears, but instead of causing pain, it acted as a fuel, driving me to look deeper into the 10K filings and the hidden ledgers of the Whitmore family office. I was no longer a girl from a 580-square-foot duplex trying to fit into a world of limestone and silk. I was a forensic specialist dissecting a cadaver of a fortune, and I was finding that the cause of death was greed. As the first hint of gray dawn began to bleed through the cheap Venetian blinds of my studio, I reached the final page of the 14th statement and found the smoking gun I had been looking for. A series of wire transfers totaling $3.2 million sent to a private account in Switzerland just 3 days before Whitmore Holdings declared a massive loss to its shareholders. It was a textbook case of embezzlement and bankruptcy fraud, a crime so blatant it almost felt like an insult to my intelligence. I leaned my head back against the wall, the cool plaster a comfort against my heated skin, and I let out a long, slow breath that carried away the last remnants of my hesitation. I had the names, I had the dates, I had the exact dollar amounts down to the cent, and I had the motivation to see this through to the very end of the line. The arrogance on the left side of my legal pad was finally balanced by the liabilities on the right, and the equation was now closed. I looked at the $20 bill again, then at the photo of my mother on the desk. A photo taken at my graduation, where she looked so proud, so tired, and so incredibly beautiful in her Kohl's cardigan. I realized that the moral of this story wasn't about revenge, though revenge would be a sweet byproduct. It was about the restoration of dignity. Sterling Whitmore believed that money granted him the right to be cruel, but he had forgotten that money is just a series of entries in a ledger, and ledgers can be audited. Family isn't the blood that runs through your veins or the name etched into a limestone gate. It is the person who sits on the floor with you at 2:14 a.m. and helps you build a future out of the wreckage of the past. I closed my laptop with a definitive click, the sound echoing in the small room like a gavel bringing a court to order. I wasn't just leaving Julian. I was erasing the very world he thought he ruled. And by the time I was finished, the only thing left of the Whitmore legacy would be the smell of the industrial floor cleaner they had so heartlessly mocked. I stood up, my legs stiff but my heart light, and I walked to the window to watch the sun rise over a world that was about to change forever for the man who thought he was untouchable. My mother would never have to pull her sleeves over her knuckles in shame again, because I was going to ensure that the only people who would be scrubbing floors in the near future were the ones who had forgotten what it meant to be human. The audit had begun, and there was no amount of vintage crystal that could save Sterling Whitmore now. I used my credentials as a master of forensic accounting to spend the next 18 grueling months digging through the digital catacombs of public records, tax liens, and leaked internal memos from Whitmore Global Logistics, a process that felt less like office work and more like performing a slow and methodical autopsy on a living creature that didn't yet know it was dead. I moved out of the apartment I shared with Harrison and retreated into a small workspace where the only sounds were the scratching of my pen and the constant hum of my high-speed scanner, transforming my life into a singular mission of financial retribution. During those long nights, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the memory of my mother's trembling hands at the Gilded Lily, I found the definitive proof of Sterling's downfall. Exactly $1,142,000 in offshore transfers routed through a series of shell companies in the British Virgin Islands that were never reported to the IRS, a sum that represented a staggering level of systematic tax evasion. I spent $5,000 of my hard-earned savings, money I had originally set aside for a down payment on a modest condo for my mother, to hire Eleanor Vance, a retired federal prosecutor who now operates out of a smoke-scented office in a historic district where the mahogany bookshelves groan under the weight of leather-bound legal precedents. Eleanor is a woman who smells of expensive Virginia tobacco and old paper, possessing eyes that have seen every trick in the book and a mind that functions with the cold efficiency of a guillotine. Together, we spent hundreds of hours cross-referencing shipping manifests with bank ledgers, meticulously documenting the gap between the Whitmores' public image and their private larceny until we had compiled a 340-page dossier contained within a heavy, ominous black binder that felt as dense and final as a tombstone. The level of detail required to dismantle an empire like Sterling's was immense, requiring me to track the movement of funds from Whitmore Global Logistics headquarters in a glass and steel tower in Hartford, Connecticut, down to the smallest line items in their fuel expenditure reports. I discovered that Sterling had been inflating the costs of his shipping fleet, specifically a series of 2022 Freightliner Cascadia semi-trucks, by nearly 15%, and siphoning the difference into an account held by a fictitious maintenance firm registered to a dead-end address in Panama. Every time I uncovered a new layer of the fraud, I thought about the $20 bills Sterling had slid across the table, and I added another page to the binder, ensuring that every cent of that $1,142,000 was accounted for with ironclad evidence. Eleanor would sit across from me in her dimly lit office, her silver hair illuminated by a single brass desk lamp, and point out the subtle legal nuances that would turn a simple audit into a criminal indictment. She taught me how to look for the financial fingerprints left behind by men who think they are too important to get caught, showing me that Sterling's arrogance was his greatest vulnerability because it made him sloppy in the details he considered beneath him. We spent $1,200 just on professional printing and high-resolution forensic imaging to ensure that the copies of the wire transfers were indisputable, creating a visual narrative of greed that even the most sympathetic jury would find abhorrent. The air in Eleanor's office was always thick with the scent of mahogany and the weight of justice, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic smell of the hospital wards where my mother still worked 40 hours a week, oblivious to the storm I was brewing in the shadows. My mother, Lucia, noticed the change in me, the way my eyes had become hard and my conversations brief. But I couldn't tell her the truth yet because I needed her to remain the innocent victim in the eyes of the law. I watched her come home from her shifts at St. Jude's, her shoulders slumped and her feet aching, and I would place my hand on the black binder hidden beneath my desk, feeling the physical weight of the 340 pages that were going to change her life forever. I had become an expert on the inner workings of Whitmore Global Logistics, knowing the exact model numbers of their warehouse equipment and the specific terms of their international shipping contracts better than Sterling himself ever did. I found that they had been avoiding import duties on high-end electronic components by misclassifying them as industrial scrap metal, a maneuver that saved them millions in the short term but created a paper trail of federal crimes that spanned 3 different continents. Every time I felt my resolve waver, I remembered Harrison's silent cowardice and the way he looked at his phone while his father destroyed my mother's dignity, and I would dive back into the spreadsheets with renewed ferocity. The black binder grew thicker, filled with color-coded tabs and notarized affidavits, a masterpiece of forensic accounting that mapped out the $1,142,000 in unreported income with the precision of a surgical map. The cost of the investigation was not just financial, it was the toll of 18 months of isolation, of living in a world of numbers and lies while my peers were planning weddings and vacations. I sat at my desk at 3 a.m., the blue light of my monitor reflecting off my glasses, and I realized that I was no longer the girl who was afraid of a utility bill. I was the architect of a catastrophe. Eleanor Vance became my mentor in the art of the kill, her smoke-scented wisdom guiding me through the complexities of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, which we intended to use as the foundation for our legal assault. We documented the specific dates of the offshore transfers, many of which coincided with Sterling's lavish personal purchases, such as the $85,000 Patek Philippe watch he had bought the same day he diverted funds from the Employee Pension Trust. The contrast between his $3.8 million limestone mansion and the paper trail of his crimes was so stark it was almost poetic, a narrative of a man who believed he could buy his way out of morality. The 340-page dossier was not just a collection of documents, it was a weapon of mass destruction aimed directly at the heart of the Whitmore legacy, and as I turned the final page and clicked the binder shut, I knew the time for preparation was over. The final month of the investigation was spent verifying the identities of the whistleblowers I had managed to flip, low-level accountants and warehouse managers who had been bullied by Sterling for years and were eager to see him fall. I paid for secure servers and encrypted communication lines to protect our data, ensuring that not a single byte of our 340-page dossier could be intercepted by the Whitmore's private security team. I thought about the black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe that Sterling used to intimidate his competitors, and I smiled, knowing that soon that vehicle would likely be seized as a forfeit asset in a federal asset forfeiture proceeding. Eleanor and I met one last time in her mahogany-lined sanctuary to review the strategy, the smoke from her cigarette curling around the heavy black binder like a ghostly sentinel. She told me that in all her years as a prosecutor, she had never seen a more thorough or devastating audit, and that Sterling Whitmore had no idea he was about to be hit by a legal freight train. I left her office that day with the binder tucked under my arm, the weight of it a comfort, a tangible manifestation of 18 months of pursuit and the $5,000 investment in justice that was about to pay the highest dividends imaginable. As I drove home in my 2014 Honda Civic, the car Sterling had mocked, I felt a sense of profound calm because the numbers were on my side, and numbers never lie. I looked at the city of Richmond passing by, the familiar streets where my mother had walked to work for 22 years, and I realized that the titanium wall was finally coming down. The $1,142,000 in offshore transfers was the key that would unlock the cell door for Sterling and the vault for my mother, a reversal of fortunes that was as inevitable as the math that proved it. I arrived at my studio apartment and set the heavy black binder on the table, the centerpiece of my life and the instrument of my revenge. I thought about the moral of this journey, that dignity cannot be bought with vintage Cristal or Tom Ford suits, but it can certainly be defended with a yellow legal pad and a commitment to the truth. The dossier was ready, the federal prosecutor was prepared, and the Whitmore family was still living in the blissful ignorance of their own perceived invincibility. I reached into my pocket and touched the $20 bill one last time before placing it on top of the binder, a small paper weight for a massive paper justice. Family is the person who fights for you when you are too tired to fight for yourself. And as I prepared to deliver the dossier to the authorities, I knew that I had finally become the protector my mother deserved. The audit was complete, the evidence was absolute, and the fall of the House of Whitmore was no longer a dream, but a 340-page reality waiting to be read. The trap was set with the kind of architectural precision that only 18 months of hatred and forensic analysis could produce, manifesting at Sterling Whitmore's 60th birthday gala, an event that was less a celebration of life and more a grotesque monument to his own narcissism. The venue was a glass-walled pavilion overlooking the Long Island Sound, where the moonlight reflected off the water with a cold, uncaring shimmer that mirrored my own internal state as I prepared to dismantle the man who had tried to erase my mother. There were 185 guests in attendance, a curated collection of the Northeast's power brokers, including 3 local judges who had presided over the very cases Sterling had manipulated, and a state senator whose campaign had been quietly greased by Whitmore Global Logistics' unreported offshore funds. The catering bill alone was a staggering $52,000, featuring delicacies like gold-dusted beluga caviar served on mother-of-pearl spoons and miniature Wagyu beef sliders that cost more per bite than my mother made in an hour of scrubbing the floors of the very hospital that kept these people alive. Sterling was standing near a 6-tier ice sculpture carved in the shape of a soaring eagle, the frozen wingspan spanning 4 feet and dripping slowly onto the polished marble floor. And he was currently holding court with a glass of 1996 Dom Perignon in his hand, bragging about his impeccable record of integrity and the foundational values of the Whitmore name. I arrived at precisely 8:45 p.m., the exact moment the first round of toasts was scheduled to begin, wearing a sharp $900 black blazer from Theory that I had tailored to fit me like a suit of armor, providing a silhouette of professional lethality that stood out against the sea of soft silk and chiffon gowns. In my right hand, I held the heavy black binder, the 340-page dossier of his ruin, gripping it not as a collection of papers, but as a weapon of absolute reputational execution. I didn't come for the $52,000 catering or the hollow pleasantries of a man I once intended to call family. I came to pull the thread that would unravel every lie Sterling had ever told to the people in this room. The air inside the pavilion was cloying, a mixture of expensive oud wood cologne, floral arrangements that cost 5 figures, and the underlying scent of fear that usually accompanies men who have spent their lives looking over their shoulders for the inevitable audit. I moved through the crowd with a calculated rhythmic gait, my heels clicking against the marble like the ticking of a countdown clock, ignoring the confused glances from the few guests who recognized me as the girl Harrison had dumped after the graduation dinner disaster. Sterling didn't see me until I was standing 10 feet away, positioned perfectly under the glare of the recessed LED spotlights that made the ice sculpture sparkle with a deceptive purity. He was in the middle of a sentence about his recent charitable donation to the hospital wing, a donation I knew was actually a laundered tax write-off, when his eyes met mine, and I watched the color drain from his face, replaced by a mottled, indignant red that clashed with his $1,200 Tom Ford suit. Harrison was standing beside him, looking every bit the subservient heir in a tuxedo that probably cost more than my first 2 years of college, and his jaw dropped as he saw the black binder tucked under my arm. "Cassidy, what the hell are you doing here?" Sterling hissed, his voice dropping an octave as he tried to maintain the illusion of composure for the state senator standing to his left, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of a whispered argument. I waited for the room to quiet, for the natural lull in conversation that occurs when a predator enters the clearing, and then I stepped forward into the center of the light, the 340 pages of forensic truth feeling heavier and more substantial with every passing second. The hyper-realism of the moment was intoxicating, from the way the condensation was beginning to pool at the base of the ice eagle to the faint, high-pitched ringing in my ears that signaled the finality of the confrontation. I didn't raise my voice because I didn't have to. The silence of the room was already working in my favor as the 185 guests turned their heads like a collective organism, sensing that the impeccable record Sterling had been touting was about to be subjected to a public autopsy. "Sterling," I said, my voice carrying with a cold, clinical resonance that cut through the soft, orchestral music playing in the background. "You spent the better part of your life treating my mother like a contaminant because she works for a living. But I think it's time this room saw what you've been doing with the money you stole from her pension and the state's tax coffers." I saw the state senator's eyes dart toward the exit, a classic flight response from a man who knew he was currently standing next to a sinking ship, and I felt a surge of predatory satisfaction as I unlatched the heavy black binder, the sound of the metal rings snapping open echoing like a gunshot through the glass pavilion. I didn't just hand him the binder. I began to read the line items out loud, projecting the reality of the $1,142,000 in offshore transfers into the space where he had just been bragging about his legacy. I detailed the specific dates of the wire transfers to the Cayman accounts, the exact model numbers of the shipping fleet he had used as a front for his embezzlement, and the $5,000 I had spent to ensure that every word in this document was backed by a federal-level investigation. The guests watched in a horrified, paralyzed fascination as I dismantled the limestone mansion, the Tom Ford suits, and the $4,200 champagne bottles, revealing them to be nothing more than the spoils of a systematic criminal enterprise. Sterling tried to reach for the binder, his manicured hand trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. But I stepped back, holding the document high so that the 3 local judges could see the notarized affidavits and the forensic imaging of his doctored ledgers. Harrison tried to intervene, stepping forward with a pathetic look of betrayal on his face, but one look from me, a look that held the weight of every night I spent on that studio apartment floor, sent him retreating back into his father's shadow where he belonged. The moral of the evening was becoming clear to everyone in attendance. A reputation built on the degradation of others is a house built on sand, and tonight the tide had finally come in. I watched as the state senator quietly handed his drink to a waiter and disappeared into the shadows of the garden, followed shortly by the judges who realized that staying near Sterling Whitmore was now a professional liability they couldn't afford. The $52,000 catering went untouched as the reality of the situation settled over the room like a cold fog, the scent of the gold-dusted caviar now seeming nauseatingly symbolic of the rot I was exposing. Sterling was no longer the king of Greenwich. He was a man in a borrowed suit standing next to a melting ice sculpture, stripped of his dignity by the very girl he had tried to buy off with a $20 bill. I took that same $20 bill out of my blazer pocket, the paper crumpled and worn from 18 months of being carried as a talisman, and I dropped it at his feet, the small green slip of paper looking more valuable than anything else in the room, because it represented the only honest thing Sterling Whitmore had touched in years. This wasn't a tantrum. It was a public execution of a legacy that had been used as a boot on the neck of the working class for far too long. I finished reading the summary of the $1.2 million IRS lien that Eleanor Vance and I had prepared, and then I snapped the binder shut with a finality that seemed to ripple through the glass walls. The impeccable record you mentioned, Sterling, is currently being reviewed by the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS, I said, looking him straight in the eyes as he stood there, broken and exposed in front of the 185 people whose respect he had spent decades buying. My name is Cassidy Thorne, and I am the daughter of the woman you called the help, and I think I've finally finished the cleaning you asked for. I turned on my heel and walked out of the pavilion, the sound of my heels on the marble now the only noise in a room that had been filled with laughter just minutes before. Outside, the black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe that had once been a symbol of his power was sitting in the valet line, but I knew that by tomorrow morning, it would be a listed asset in a federal seizure. As I walked toward my 2014 Honda Civic, the night air felt crisp and clean, free of the suffocating scent of Sterling's expensive cologne and the metallic tang of his arrogance. I had spent $5,000 and 18 months of my life to reach this moment. But the return on that investment was immeasurable because I had restored my mother's name to its rightful place above the filth of the Whitmore empire. Family isn't the prestige of a name or the weight of a bank account. It's the person who stands up in a room full of giants and tells the truth until the giants start to look like the small, hollow men they actually are. I drove away from the gala, the lights of the pavilion fading in my rearview mirror, and I felt a profound sense of closure that no amount of money could ever provide. The trap had been sprung, the audit was public, and Sterling Whitmore was finally exactly where he belonged, standing alone in the dark, watching his world melt away like a 6-tier ice sculpture in the heat of the truth. My mother would be waking up in a few hours for her shift at the hospital, and for the first time in 22 years, she would be going to work in a world where her daughter had ensured that the people who looked down on her would never be able to look down on anyone ever again. I reached out and touched the passenger seat where she usually sat, and I smiled, knowing that the 340-page binder was just the beginning of the rest of our lives. I waited with the cold, coiled patience of a predator for the precisely timed moment of the family toast, a tradition in the Whitmore household where the heirs would stand before their peers to perform a scripted act of worship toward the patriarch's ego. The room went silent, the 185 guests leaning in with their $400 crystal glasses filled to the brim with vintage champagne, expecting a warm tribute to Sterling's 60 years of perceived dominance and his impeccably curated legacy of wealth. I stepped to the microphone. The feedback let out a short, sharp chirp that echoed against the glass walls of the pavilion, and I felt the weight of the black binder in my hand as the final physical manifestation of 18 months of silent, focused labor. "Sterling," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air with a clinical, surgical precision that seemed to drop the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. "You once gave my mother $20 and told her to go find a diner where people like her belong. A moment of cruelty you likely forgot the second it happened, but one that I have carried in my marrow every day since. Tonight," I continued, looking him directly in his bloodshot eyes as he stood paralyzed next to the melting 6-tier ice sculpture, "I am returning the favor, not with a tip, but with a full accounting of what your arrogance has actually cost you." I opened the heavy black binder, the metal rings snapping with a sound like a gavel, and I began reading the exact wire transfer numbers, the long strings of alphanumeric codes that represented the $1,142,000 he had funneled through the British Virgin Islands and Panama to evade the very taxes that fund the hospital where my mother mopped the floors. The room was so quiet that I could hear the rhythmic hum of the high-end HVAC system and the soft, distant lapping of the Long Island Sound against the pier. But that silence was nothing compared to the suffocating vacuum that formed as I reached into my bag and produced a small, encrypted thumb drive. I stepped over to the technician's booth, where a confused 20-year-old was waiting to start the sentimental birthday slideshow, and I commanded the system, projecting the fraudulent tax returns and the incriminating ledgers of Whitmore Global Logistics directly onto the massive 150-inch presentation screen that was meant to display photos of Sterling's childhood and his various business triumphs. The bright, high-definition glare of the projector illuminated the room in a harsh, clinical blue, turning the festive pavilion into a courtroom as the guests watched the mathematical proof of Sterling's larceny scroll across the screen in 80-point font. The silence was absolute, a heavy and suffocating shroud that was broken only by the sudden, discordant sound of a $400 shot Zweisel crystal glass shattering on the polished marble floor as one of the local judges let his drink slip from his numb fingers. Sterling's face underwent a terrifying transformation, shifting from a ghostly ashen pale to a dark, sickly purple that looked like a bruised plum in the flickering light of his own ruined reputation. He clutched the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white, as the state senator he had spent years bribing stood up and walked toward the exit without looking back, his departure signaling the end of the Whitmore social era. I didn't stop reading. I detailed the 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe leases that were technically in default and the $1.2 million IRS lien that Eleanor Vance had helped me finalize, making sure every guest in that room knew that the man they were celebrating was a hollowed-out fraud whose Tom Ford suits were the only thing holding him upright. The hyper-realism of the destruction was palpable, from the way the light from the projector reflected off the Ice Eagle's melting wings to the specific scent of the gold-dusted caviar that now felt like an insult to everyone who had been fooled by Sterling's facade. My mother, Lucia, was not in that room to see this, but her presence was everywhere in the way I spoke her name and the way I defended the dignity he had tried to strip from her with a single $20 bill. I looked at Harrison, who was slumped in his chair, his $350 gold tie clip glinting mockingly in the light of the tax returns, and I saw the realization dawn on him that his inheritance was not a mountain of gold, but a mountain of debt and criminal liabilities. Sterling tried to move, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no words came out because there is no defense for the cold, hard numbers of a forensic audit. The $52,000 catering bill, the $4,200 champagne, and the $3.8 million limestone mansion were all being dismantled in real time, replaced by the digital reality of a 340-page dossier that left no room for interpretation or apology. I felt a profound sense of lightness as I watched the 185 guests begin to murmur, a low-frequency hum of gossip and judgment that replaced the reverence they had shown just moments before. The titanium wall had not just been breached, it had been leveled, and the man who thought he was a giant was now revealed to be the smallest person in the room. I finished my presentation with the final wire transfer, a $3.2 million embezzled payment to a Swiss account, and I closed the binder with a definitive bone-deep satisfaction that resonated through my entire body. Sterling's sickly purple face was the last image I wanted to burn into my memory, a visual receipt for every hour my mother had spent on her knees and every winter night we had spent shivering at 62 degrees to save on a $180 utility bill. The moral of the evening was written in the flickering light of the 150-inch screen. You cannot buy a soul, and you certainly cannot audit your way out of the consequences of being a monster. As I stepped down from the microphone, the silence remained, a testament to the magnitude of the execution I had just performed in front of the town's elite. I walked past Sterling, who was now being avoided by the waitstaff and his own business associates, as if his bankruptcy were contagious, and I didn't feel a single drop of pity for the man who had found my mother's peeling skin to be an eyesore. My name is Cassidy Thorne, and I had come to the Gilded Lily to settle a debt that wasn't measured in currency, but in the restoration of a woman's worth. I walked out into the night air, leaving the shattered crystal and the dark purple face of a dying empire behind me, knowing that the real toast of the evening was the one I would share with my mother in the quiet, honest safety of our home. The public execution was over, the reputation was dead, and as I drove away from the pavilion, I realized that for the first time in 26 years, the only thing that smelled like industrial floor cleaner was the future, clean, sterile, and ready for a brand new story. The fallout from that night was total and absolute, a financial and social scorched earth campaign that left the Whitmore legacy in a pile of ash and legal filings. Within 90 days of my public presentation at the gala, Sterling was under a formal federal indictment for 13 counts of tax evasion, wire fraud, and embezzlement, a transformation from a titan of industry to a criminal defendant that happened with the dizzying speed of a free-falling elevator. His once limitless assets were frozen by a court order that turned his titanium credit cards into useless pieces of plastic and his offshore accounts into inaccessible digital ghost towns. To cover the initial $250,000 retainer for a high-profile defense lawyer who specialized in white-collar catastrophe, Sterling was forced to liquidate the $3.8 million limestone mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, selling it at a fire sale price to a private equity group that cared nothing for the history of the house or the man who had lost it. I watched the news reports from a distance, seeing the grainy footage of federal agents in windbreakers carrying boxes of evidence out of the front door he once thought I was unworthy to enter, and I felt a sense of justice that was far more satisfying than any of the vintage Cristal he had ever poured. Harrison, the man who had stood by in gold-plated silence while his father humiliated my mother, tried to call my phone 42 times in a single week, his name flashing on my screen like a desperate signal from a drowning ship. I didn't answer a single one. Instead, I took great satisfaction in the finality of the block button before eventually changing my number entirely and moving my mother far away from the toxic reach of the Whitmore ruin. I used the whistleblower bounty I received from the IRS, a substantial percentage of the $1,142,000 in recovered funds, to move my mother, Lucia, into a luxury 1,800-square-foot, two-bedroom condo on the top floor of a high-rise with a panoramic view of the park and the city skyline. The apartment features floor-to-ceiling windows, white oak flooring that feels like silk underfoot, and a kitchen with professional-grade Wolf and Sub-Zero appliances that she will never have to use for anything other than her own enjoyment. Now, the only scent of industrial cleaner or bleach in her life comes from the high-end cleaning service I pay $300 a week to maintain her home, a team of professionals who treat her with the utmost respect and leave the air smelling of fresh eucalyptus and expensive linen. My mother no longer has to pull her sleeves over her knuckles to hide the chemical burns of a life spent in service. Instead, she spends her mornings on her balcony with a cup of premium Kona coffee, watching the sun rise over a city that used to ignore her existence. Her hands, once red and peeling from 22 years at St. Jude's Hospital, have finally healed, the skin softened by the luxury creams I buy her and the absence of the caustic degreasers that once defined her days. She earns no more hourly wages because she is retired, living on the interest of a life that was finally audited for its true value rather than its bank balance. The hyper-realism of our new life is a constant reminder of the war I won, from the silent, motorized shades in her bedroom to the way the $300 a week cleaning crew leaves fresh-cut lilies in her entryway every Tuesday. I think about the $20 bill I kept, the one I eventually framed and hung in my own office as a reminder of the night the titanium wall came down, and I realize that the cost of Sterling's arrogance was everything he ever owned. Harrison is currently living in a rented studio apartment in a part of the city he once looked down upon, his 2024 Porsche 911 long since repossessed and his $350 gold tie clip likely sitting in a pawn shop to pay for his groceries. He was a man who chose a legacy of lies over a future of truth, and now he is learning the hard way that when the foundation is rot, the entire structure eventually collapses. I see his name occasionally in the local legal journals, mentioned as a witness in his father's ongoing trial, and I feel nothing but a cold, distant pity for the boy who didn't have the courage to be a man. My name is Cassidy Thorne, and I am the forensic accountant who proved that the most valuable asset any family can possess is the dignity of its members and the honesty of its name. The 340-page dossier is now a permanent part of a federal case file, but for me, it is the document that freed my mother from the prison of $19.50 an hour and the $180 utility bills that used to keep her awake at night. We don't talk about the Whitmores anymore. Their name has been scrubbed from our vocabulary just as the industrial floor cleaner has been scrubbed from our lives. When I visit her in her new home and we sit together on her $8,000 Italian leather sofa, I look at her face and I see a woman who is no longer small or defenseless, but a woman who knows her worth was never determined by the people who tried to diminish her. The moral of this long and arduous journey is that family isn't the blood that shares your DNA or the name on a limestone gate. It is the person who is willing to burn down an empire to protect your heart. Sterling Whitmore thought he was teaching us a lesson about our place in the world, but in the end, I was the one who taught him that the help is the only reason the house stands at all, and when the help leaves, the house falls. I am 26 years old, and I have learned that numbers may never lie, but people do, and the only way to survive a world of lies is to become the person who knows how to count the cost of the truth. My mother is finally safe, the audit is closed, and the only thing left of the Whitmore legacy is the shattering sound of a crystal glass that no one is coming to clean up. I look out the window at the park, the green trees swaying in the gentle Richmond breeze, and I know that every cent of the $5,000 I spent on Eleanor Vance and every hour of the 18 months I spent in the dark was worth it for the look of peace on my mother's face. The story of the Thorne family is no longer one of survival in a 580-square-foot duplex, but one of triumph in a world that finally had to pay its debts. As I stand here in the quiet luxury of this new reality, I realize that the most profound change isn't the $300 cleaning service or the high-end condo, but the fact that my mother never has to look at her hands with shame again. She is the lead custodian of her own life now, and the only person she has to answer to is herself. The fallout was total for Sterling, but for us, it was a beginning, a clean slate where the numbers finally balance and the truth is the only currency that matters. Family is who stays, who fights, and who returns the favor when the world tries to take your dignity away, and I am proud to be the daughter of the woman who survived the bleach and the ammonia to see the lilies bloom in her own living room. The audit is over, the verdict is in, and we have finally found where we belong. Not at a table of frauds, but at a table of our own making, where the only smell in the air is the sweet, undeniable scent of freedom.